The Clockmaker's final hour. In the heart of a forgotten city, nestled between narrow alleys and beneath the shadow of crumbling towers, there stood a small, dimly lit shop, the timekeeper's workshop. It was a place where time itself seemed to stand still, where the only sound was the steady tick of countless clocks, each one a masterpiece of craftsmanship. The shop's owner, a man known only as Elias Graves, was a clockmaker of unparalleled skill, a master of his craft who had spent his life bending time to his will. Elias was a solitary man, his face pale and drawn, his eyes sharp and calculating. He was obsessed with the art of time, with the intricate gears and springs that powered the world's most delicate mechanisms. He had built clocks for kings and commoners alike, each one more intricate than the last, but none had brought him the satisfaction he sought. He yearned for something more, a clock that could do what no other could, predict the moment of death. It was an obsession that consumed him, driving him to work late into the night, his hands trembling with excitement as he crafted the timepiece that would fulfill his darkest desire. He called it the final hour, a clock unlike any other. Its face was a silver disc, etched with strange symbols, and its hands were fashioned from the finest steel, moving not in the usual increments of minutes and hours, but in the seconds that marked the end of life itself. The clock, he believed, would be able to measure the precise moment when a soul would depart this world. For months, Elias toiled away in his workshop, pouring all his skill and knowledge into the creation of the clock. His hair grew long and unkempt, his skin grew pale and gaunt, and his once pristine clothing became stained with oil and dust. But he cared not for such things. His mind was consumed by the clock, and he was driven by the knowledge that once it was complete, he would have the power to know the moment of death, an achievement that would elevate him above all others. At last, after many long months, the clock was finished. Elias stood before it, his breath shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. The clock sat upon a pedestal, its hands frozen at midnight, its face gleaming with an eerie light. He felt a strange sense of triumph, but also a creeping unease. For in the depths of his soul, he knew that the clock was more than just a tool. It was a harbinger, a gateway to something darker than he could comprehend. With trembling hands, Elias wound the clock, setting its gears into motion. The hands began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, ticking away the seconds, each one a reminder of the fleeting nature of life. He watched in awe as the clock ticked on, its relentless march forward, each passing second bringing him closer to something he could not yet understand. But then, something strange happened. The clock's hands began to move faster, faster than they should have, as if the very fabric of time itself were unraveling. Elias felt a chill creep down his spine, and his heart began to race. He glanced at the clock's face, his eyes widening in horror. The hands were no longer moving in a predictable pattern. They were spinning wildly, faster and faster, as if they were racing toward an inevitable conclusion. And then, with a final deafening clang, the clock stopped. Elias stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. The silence that followed was oppressive, suffocating. He dared not move, dared not breathe, for fear that the clock would start again, and he would be caught in its endless cycle. But as the minutes stretched into hours, and the hours into days, Elias realized that the clock was not merely a tool, it was a curse. For as the clock had ticked, so too had it begun to mark the moments of Elias's own life. Each second that passed brought him closer to his own death, and the more he looked at the clock, the more he felt the weight of its gaze upon him. It was as if the clock had become a living thing, a malevolent force that had taken hold of him, its ticking now the sound of his own heartbeat. Days turned into weeks, and Elias found himself trapped in a race against time. The clock's hands moved relentlessly forward, and with each passing moment, he felt his strength waning. His once sharp mind grew clouded, his body grew frail, and his once pristine workshop became a tomb of dust and decay. He could not escape the clock's grasp. It was as if the very passage of time had become his enemy, and there was no way to outrun it. The villagers, once curious about the strange man who had lived in the shop, soon began to whisper about his disappearance. No one had seen him for days, and the air around the shop grew heavy with an unnatural stillness. Some claimed to hear the sound of ticking in the dead of night, while others swore they saw the faint glow of light flickering from the windows, as if the clock itself were alive. The candle that burned forever. It was late in the autumn of 1884 when Professor Alistair Thorne, a scholar of ancient texts and forgotten histories, first came across the monastery of St. Marcellus. The journey had taken him far from the comforts of London, through desolate hills and dense forests, to a crumbling edifice that time had all but forgotten. The monastery, once a place of piety and peace, now stood abandoned, its stone walls weathered and cracked, its roof long since caved in by the relentless passage of years. The very air around it seemed thick with the weight of centuries, and the ground was choked with the overgrowth of nature's relentless reclaiming. Alistair had heard rumors of the place, the stories told by local villagers in hushed tones, of strange occurrences and an eerie light that sometimes flickered from the ruins at night. They spoke of a candle, a flame that burned with an unnatural light, one that never went out, no matter how much time passed. But such tales, Alistair thought, were nothing more than superstition, the fanciful imaginings of simple folk. He had come to the monastery not for such nonsense, but to study the ancient manuscripts said to be hidden within its walls, texts believed to contain knowledge lost to the world, knowledge that would advance his studies and elevate his standing among his peers. He arrived at the monastery's gates just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. The air grew colder, and the wind whispered through the ruins, as if the very stones were alive with secrets. With a sense of both excitement and trepidation, Alistair pushed open the rusted gates and made his way through the overgrown courtyard, his lantern casting a flickering light that barely cut through the darkness. The monastery's main hall was a vast, empty space, its once grand arches now broken and crumbling. The remnants of old pews lay scattered about, their wood rotted and decayed. Alistair moved deeper into the building, his footsteps echoing in the silence until he came upon the crypt, a dark and foreboding chamber beneath the monastery. The door to the crypt was ajar, as though inviting him to enter. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and mildew, and the walls were lined with ancient stone sarcophagi. But it was the center of the room that caught Alistair's attention, a pedestal upon which stood a single waxen candle. The flame of the candle flickered in the stillness, casting long, wavering shadows upon the walls. What struck Alistair most was that the candle's flame was not ordinary. It burned with an unnatural, otherworldly glow, as though the light itself were alive, pulsing with a strange, malevolent energy. He approached the candle cautiously, his breath catching in his throat. The flame seemed to beckon him, drawing him closer, and as he reached out to touch it, he felt a sudden chill run through his body. His hand trembled as he held it just above the flame, but he could feel no heat, no warmth. It was as though the candle existed outside the laws of nature, as though it were a thing of another world entirely. Alistair's curiosity overcame him, and he took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the candle. As he did, the air around him seemed to grow heavier, the shadows in the room deepening, and the light from the candle began to change. It flickered and danced, casting strange, distorted shapes upon the walls. And then, to his horror, Alistair saw something that made his blood run cold. In the shifting shadows he saw faces, twisted, contorted faces, their eyes wide with terror. They were not the faces of the living, but the faces of the dead, their mouths open in silent screams, their features frozen in eternal agony. They seemed to move, to writhe within the shadows, as though they were trapped within the light of the candle itself, bound by its malevolent power. Alistair stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached for his lantern, but it was no use. The shadows seemed to grow, to stretch out toward him, and the faces in the dark grew clearer, more defined. They were not merely illusions. They were real, or had once been real. He could see their features now, the gauntness of their faces, the hollow eyes, the skin drawn tight over their bones. They were the lost souls of those who had once walked the earth, trapped in the light of the eternal flame. The air grew thick with a suffocating presence, and Alistair could hear whispers, low, guttural voices that seemed to come from all directions. They spoke in a language he could not understand, their words filled with a deep, primal terror. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled his mind, drowning out all other sound. Alistair turned to flee, but the shadows closed in around him, the faces pressing in on him from all sides. The candle's light seemed to reach out as though it were pulling him toward it, toward the horrors that it revealed. The Tavern of Lost Souls. It was a bitter winter night when Samuel Dunsford, a weary traveler, found himself wandering through the desolate hills of northern England. The wind howled through the trees, its icy fingers clawing at his skin, and the dark clouds overhead seemed to press down upon the earth, blocking out the light of the stars. He had been journeying for days, seeking shelter from the storm, when, as if by some cruel twist of fate, he stumbled upon a small, hidden path, barely visible beneath the snow. The path wound its way through the dense forest, and though Samuel hesitated, a strange compulsion urged him forward. He had heard rumors of a tavern, a place where travelers could find warmth and rest, hidden deep within the woods. It was said to be a refuge for those lost in the wilderness, a place where one could escape the cold and the darkness of the night. And so, with little more than the hope of a warm fire and a bed for the night, Samuel pressed on. After what seemed an eternity, the trees parted, and before him stood a low, weathered building, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. The sign above the door read, "The Tavern of Lost Souls," its letters carved into the wood in an old, almost forgotten script. There was something unsettling about the place, something that made the hairs on the back of Samuel's neck stand on end. Yet the cold gnawed at his bones, and the thought of warmth was too tempting to resist. He stepped inside. The warmth of the tavern was immediate, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The fire in the hearth crackled, sending flickers of light dancing across the room. The smell of roasting meat and spiced wine filled the air, and the low murmur of conversation echoed in the dimly lit space. The tavern was full of patrons, men and women of all ages, their faces worn and weary, their clothes tattered from travel. Yet there was something odd about them, something that Samuel could not quite place. The patrons did not seem to notice him as he entered, nor did they acknowledge his presence. They were lost in their own conversations, their laughter hollow, their eyes distant. Samuel's gaze swept over the room, and he noticed that there was no exit, no door leading out into the night. The windows were fogged over, as though they had not been opened in years. It was as if the tavern existed in a place outside of time, a place where the passage of hours meant nothing, A figure behind the bar, a tall man with a gaunt face and a blackened apron, nodded at Samuel as he approached. "Welcome, traveler," the bartender said, his voice low and gravelly. "You've found your way to the Tavern of Lost Souls, a place for those who wander too far, and for those who can never leave." Samuel hesitated, unsettled by the man's words. "I've heard of this place," he said slowly. "I've heard it's a refuge for the lost." The bartender's smile was thin and cold. "A refuge, yes, but also a prison. For those who come here, there is no escape. Not until the night is done, and the dawn never comes." Samuel's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? I don't understand." The bartender's eyes darkened. "You will, in time. Drink your fill, traveler. You will find what you seek here, but know this. Once you have tasted the wine, once you have partaken in the revelry, you will never leave. The night will stretch on, and you will remain, trapped in this place, forever." Despite the ominous warning, Samuel found himself drawn to the bar, compelled by a thirst he could not explain. The bartender poured him a glass of dark, rich wine, its scent intoxicating, its color deep as blood. Samuel took a sip, and as the liquid burned down his throat, he felt a strange warmth spread through him. The weariness that had clung to him for days seemed to melt away, and for a moment, he felt alive in a way he had not felt in years. But as the night wore on, Samuel began to notice the true nature of the tavern. The laughter of the patrons grew louder, more frantic, as though they were caught in a never-ending cycle of joy and sorrow. The conversations were hollow, repeating the same words, the same phrases, over and over again. Faces that once seemed familiar now appeared twisted, their features contorted in expressions of despair. The eyes of the patrons were empty, glazed over, as though they were not truly present in the moment, but trapped in some endless dream. Samuel tried to speak with them, to ask them why they remained, but they only smiled and laughed, their responses nonsensical and disjointed. He turned to the bartender, but the man had vanished, replaced by a woman with hollow eyes and a pale, lifeless face. She too smiled at him, but there was no warmth in her gaze, only a hollow emptiness. It was then that Samuel realized the truth. These were not ordinary people. They were the lost souls of those who had wandered into the tavern, never to leave. They were trapped in a perpetual night, bound by the curse of the Specter of Ravenwood Hall. It was a cold, dreary evening in late autumn, when Thomas and Eleanor Hargrave first set eyes upon Ravenwood Hall. The mansion, an imposing structure of gray stone, stood at the edge of a forgotten moor, its silhouette etched against the darkening sky. Its towering spires pierced the heavens, and its windows, though dark and shuttered, seemed to watch them as they approached. It was a place of mystery and old secrets, a house steeped in a history that had been buried beneath layers of time and dust. The couple had come to claim their inheritance, a legacy passed down through Thomas's family for generations. It was a grand gesture, a symbol of wealth and status, and they had been overjoyed at the prospect of beginning their new life in such an illustrious home. Eleanor, ever the romantic, imagined herself walking through its grand halls, the scent of roses filling the air, the soft murmur of laughter echoing from its rooms. Thomas, more practical by nature, had been less certain, but the promise of a life free from the constraints of their modest beginnings had been too tempting to resist. As they arrived, the gates of Ravenwood Hall creaked open, revealing a long, winding path that led to the front door. The house seemed to loom over them, its ancient stones covered in ivy, its windows dark and lifeless. There was an air of neglect about it, as though the mansion had been abandoned for years. Yet the gate was not rusted, and the path was well trodden. It was as if the house were waiting for them. its silence pregnant with some unseen presence. Eleanor was the first to speak. "It's magnificent," she said, her voice filled with awe as she gazed up at the house. "Just think, Thomas, this will be our home." Thomas smiled faintly, though there was a shadow in his eyes. "It is grand, certainly, but there is something about this place that feels strange. I've heard whispers, stories of the past. You know how families like mine are, full of dark tales and old grudges." Eleanor laughed softly, dismissing his concerns. "Oh, Thomas, you're just being superstitious. It's only a house after all. We'll make it our own." They entered the house together, their footsteps echoing in the vast empty foyer. The air was thick with dust, the furniture draped in sheets, and the scent of old wood and decay lingered in the corners. Yet, despite its age, there was a certain grandeur to the place. High ceilings adorned with intricate carvings, walls lined with portraits of long-dead ancestors, and a sweeping staircase that led to the upper floors. But as they explored the house, a sense of unease settled over them, a feeling that something was amiss. Eleanor could not shake the sensation that they were not alone, that unseen eyes were watching them from the shadows. She attributed it to the house's age, to the fact that it had been abandoned for so long, but Thomas was less certain. He could feel a strange presence in the air, a weight that pressed down on him, as though the house itself were alive and its spirit restless. On their first night in Ravenwood Hall, the silence was broken by the faintest sound, a soft, mournful sobbing that echoed through the halls. Eleanor, exhausted from their journey, dismissed it as the wind or the creaking of old timbers. But Thomas, unable to sleep, rose from their bed and wandered the house, searching for the source of the sound. He wandered the dark corridors, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpets that lined the floors. The sobbing grew louder, more distinct, and he followed it, drawn to the farthest reaches of the house, to a room that had been sealed off by a heavy, dust-covered door. The door creaked open with an eerie groan, and Thomas stepped inside. The room was a forgotten relic of the past, furniture covered in sheets, the air thick with the scent of mildew and rot. But it was the large, full-length mirror that caught his attention. It was framed in dark, intricately carved wood, its surface tarnished by time, but still reflecting the dim light that filtered in through the broken shutters. And there, in the reflection, he saw her. A woman, dressed in a tattered bridal gown, her face obscured by a veil of black lace. Her eyes were hollow, empty, and her lips twisted into a grotesque grin. She was standing behind him, her pale, bony fingers reaching out to touch his shoulder. Thomas spun around, but there was no one there. His heart raced, and he felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. He stumbled backward, his mind reeling. He had seen her. He was certain of it. The ghostly bride who haunted the halls of Ravenwood Hall. He rushed back to their bedroom, but Eleanor was already awake, her face pale with fear. "What is it, Thomas?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What's wrong?" I saw something," he said, his voice shaking. "A woman, a ghost. She was in the mirror." Eleanor's eyes widened in disbelief, but there was something in her gaze that told him. The Song of the Sea Witch. The sea had always been a friend to the village of Blackwater Bay, a source of life, a giver of fish, and a constant companion to the men who made their living from its depths. But for all its bounty, the sea was also a thing of mystery and danger, a vast, unknowable expanse that seemed to harbor ancient secrets beneath its dark waves. And none of the villagers knew those secrets better than the old fishermen, whose weathered faces told tales of strange happenings and whispered warnings. It was on a night of moonless blackness that the first of the fishermen vanished. The wind had risen, howling like a beast. and the waves crashed violently against the jagged cliffs that bordered the bay. The men had been out in their boats, casting their nets in the deep waters, when the sound first reached them, a soft, haunting melody that seemed to rise from the very depths of the sea. It was a song like none they had ever heard before, a melody that tugged at the heartstrings, pulling at their very souls with an irresistible force. At first, they thought it was the wind, or perhaps the cry of some sea creature. But as the song grew louder, clearer, and more distinct, they knew it was something else, something unnatural. The first man to follow the song was old Captain Thorn, a man who had spent his life on the water. He was known for his stoic nature, for his refusal to fear the sea. But on that night, something in the song called to him, something he could not resist. He dropped his net, leaving his crew behind, and sailed alone toward the source of the melody, his boat drifting farther and farther from the shore. By dawn, Captain Thorn was gone. The village was in an uproar. The fishermen gathered, searching the bay, but no sign of Captain Thorn or his boat could be found. The sea had claimed him, and with him the hope of ever finding him again. But the song, oh, the song, continued to echo over the water, a mournful, beckoning call that seemed to promise death to any who dared listen. It was then that young Thomas Blackwell, a sailor with the heart of a lion and the spirit of adventure, arrived in Blackwater Bay. He had been away on a long voyage, but upon hearing the tales of the vanished fishermen, he knew something darker than a mere storm was at work. The villagers spoke of a legend, an ancient curse that had plagued their people for generations. It was said that deep beneath the waves, in the darkest depths of the sea, there lived a creature older than the world itself, a sea witch, whose song could draw men to their doom. Thomas, determined to uncover the truth, went to the village's oldest resident, old Madeline, who was said to know more about the sea witch than anyone alive. "Do you believe the legends?" Thomas asked her, his voice heavy with the weight of his resolve. Old Madeline's eyes were clouded with age, but there was a fire in them when she spoke. "Aye, I do. The sea witch is no myth, lad. She is real. She is as old as the sea itself, and she has taken many men before. She sings her song to lure them into the water, to claim their souls for her own. The sea is her domain, and she will not be denied." Thomas listened, his heart pounding with both fear and fascination. He had heard stories of such creatures in the distant lands he had sailed, but to hear of one so close to home filled him with a sense of dread that gnawed at his very core. "I will stop her," he declared, his voice firm despite the terror that threatened to overtake him. "I will not let her take another soul." That night, as the moon rose high above the sea, Thomas set out in his small boat, determined to find the source of the haunting melody. The wind howled around him, and the waves crashed violently against the hull, but he pressed on, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the song seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. The melody was like a siren's call, beautiful and terrible all at once. It was a song of longing, of sorrow, and of death, and it filled Thomas's mind with an irresistible pull. His hands shook as he gripped the oars, and his thoughts began to blur, his mind growing heavy with the weight of the song. As he sailed farther into the bay, the water grew colder, and the sky above him darkened. The song seemed to come from below the surface now, rising up from the depths, and Thomas could feel the very air around him vibrating with its power. He could no longer resist it. He leaned over the side of the boat, peering into the dark waters, and there, beneath the waves, he saw her, the sea witch. She was a creature of unimaginable beauty, her long hair flowing like dark seaweed, her eyes glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. Her pale, smooth skin shimmered beneath the water, and her lips moved, singing the song that had claimed so many before him. "You have come for me, sailor," she whispered, her voice sweet and seductive. "You are mine now." Thomas's heart raced, but he forced himself. The Black Fog of Ashmere. The town of Ashmere lay nestled in a valley, surrounded by dark, towering trees that whispered in the wind. It was a quiet place, isolated from the world, where the air always seemed thick with mystery. The people of Ashmere were a simple folk, their lives bound by the rhythms of nature, the seasons, and the land. Yet despite its serene appearance, there was something unsettling about the town, something that even the most seasoned traveler could not ignore. For Ashmere had a history of darkness, of things unseen, of whispers carried on the wind. It was late autumn when the fog first descended upon the town, a thick black mist that rolled in from the hills like a living thing, creeping down the streets and enveloping the houses in a shroud of impenetrable darkness. It was not the usual fog that one might expect at this time of year. No, this was something far worse. It was as though the very air had turned to ink, swallowing up the world in its depths. The fog had a weight to it, a heaviness that pressed upon the shoulders of all who ventured into it. And within its depths there was something else, something that made the blood run cold. It was young Samuel Carrington, a local farmer, who first spoke of the visions. "I saw them," he said, his voice trembling, his eyes wide with terror. "I saw them standing in the fog, figures pale as death, their faces twisted in agony. They were reaching out to me, calling my name." The townsfolk, who had long grown accustomed to the strange happenings that occasionally befell Ashmere, dismissed his words as the ramblings of a frightened man. But as the days passed and the fog grew thicker, more and more people began to speak of the same visions, of figures that appeared in the mist, of the dead walking once more. It was not long before the fog became more than just an eerie presence. It became a curse. Those who ventured into the mist never returned, and those who remained behind could hear the whispers of the lost souls, their voices carried on the wind, calling out from the depths of the fog. The townspeople spoke of strange lights flickering in the distance, of shapes moving within the blackness, of faces, pale, ghostly faces, staring from the mist, their eyes hollow and empty. Among the first to disappear was Margaret Holloway, the town's seamstress. She had been a quiet woman, her life a simple one, but she had always been kind to others. She had been seen walking toward the edge of the town, her figure swallowed by the fog, and then nothing. The townsfolk searched for days, but there was no trace of her, only the whispers of her name in the wind. Soon after, the old man, Henry Porter, vanished as well. He had lived in Ashmere for as long as anyone could remember, his face lined with age and wisdom. He had been the one to tell the children the old stories, the tales of the town's haunted past. And it was he who had first warned them of the fog, telling them in hushed tones of a curse that had been placed upon Ashmere long ago, a curse that had now returned to claim its due. But it was not just the living who were affected. The dead, too, seemed to stir in the black fog. It was on the third night of the fog's descent that Thomas Winters, the town's doctor, stood at his window, staring out into the mist. He had been unable to sleep, his mind racing with thoughts of the strange events that had befallen the town. He had heard the stories, of course, but he had always dismissed them as superstition, until now. Now he could not ignore the growing sense of dread that had settled over Ashmere. As he gazed into the fog, something caught his eye. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving in the mist. But then it grew clearer, a figure, tall and gaunt, with a face that was as pale as death itself. It was a man, or what had once been a man, his eyes empty sockets, his mouth twisted into a grimace. He was walking toward Thomas's house, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. Thomas's heart raced. He knew that face. It was Jonathan Blackwell, the town's former mayor, who had died nearly 10 years ago in a mysterious accident. His body had been found at the bottom of the cliffs, his neck broken, his eyes wide in terror. The town had never been able to explain it, but now, in the black fog, there he was, walking toward Thomas's house as if nothing had ever happened. The figure stopped at the door, and Thomas felt a chill run through him. The man's lips parted, and he whispered in a voice that was not his own. "Join us, Thomas. The fog is eternal. You cannot escape it. None of us can." The doctor stumbled back from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to run, but as he did, the fog seemed to press in around him, seeping through the cracks of the walls, filling the room with an oppressive